While I was in the hospital fighting illness, my son sold my farm to pay off his debts. I was frozen in pain when I discovered he had sold the legacy my grandfather and his mother left me for $1. $2 million. The day he came to visit me, he sat by my hospital bed smiling as if he had already won. But he didn't know I had woken up and was quietly watching him. What happened next made him collapse and regret everything. Welcome if you were in my place lying in that hospital bed and seeing everything unfold. What would you do? Comment below and let me know. Like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. This is a fictional story created to deliver a meaningful and thoughtful experience. The grass was still wet when I stepped outside. That is the thing about Iowa mornings, they do not ease you in gently. The cold comes up through the ground first through the soles of your boots before the air even has a chance to remind you what season it is. I have lived on this land long enough to stop noticing it most days. But that morning, for some reason, I noticed everything. I stood on the porch for a moment longer than usual. The sky was just beginning to separate itself from the tree line, that particular shade of gray-blue that exists nowhere else on Earth except the hour before sunrise over a cornfield. Somewhere out past the south fence, a crow called once and went quiet. The farm breathed around me the way it always did, slow and certain, like something alive that had been alive long before I got here and intended to go on long after. 380 acres. That is what my grandfather Alton left behind when he passed. Not just the land, the idea of it. The belief that a man could put his hands into the earth and pull something lasting out of it. He built the house we still live in with timber. He cut himself back when this part of Boone County was nothing but open prairie and stubborn optimism. The red roof was his idea. He said a man ought to be able to find his way home from any direction. I never argued with that. I pulled my jacket tighter and walked down toward the barn. The horses heard me coming before I reached the gate the way they always do. Ranger, the older one, pressed his nose through the slats and huffed warm breath into the cold air. I filled the feed bucket the same way I had done every morning for the better part of 40 years, measured by habit rather than thought, my hands moving on their own, while my mind stayed somewhere quieter. There is a particular kind of peace in work that has been done so many times it no longer requires concentration. You just become part of the rhythm of it. After the horses, I walked the edge of the east cornfield. The stalks from the last harvest had been turned under, and the soil was dark and soft from the recent rain. I crouched down at one point and pressed my palm flat against the ground, something my father taught me to do, though I could never explain exactly why. He said the land tells you things if you bother to listen. I am not sure I ever learned to hear it the way he did, but I kept doing it anyway because some habits are less about what they accomplish and more about who they connect you to. I straightened up slowly, my knees reminding me as they do every morning, now that I am not the man I was at 40, and I kept walking. The apple orchard was at the northwest corner of the property, just past the old water pump that had not worked properly in years, but that I refused to replace on principle. Loretta had planted those trees the spring after we were married. She had driven 2 hours to a nursery in Ames, loaded 6 bare root saplings into the back of our pickup, and planted every one of them herself while I was out fixing fence line. By the time I came back that evening, she was sitting on an overturned bucket with dirt up to her elbows, looking at those 6 small sticks in the ground, like they were already something magnificent. They'll be full grown before you know it, she told me. She was right. She was right about most things. I stopped at the edge of the orchard and looked at the trees the way I always do, when I pass through not really seeing them, but feeling what they represent. Loretta had been gone for 3 years now. The orchard kept growing without her, which seemed both right and quietly unbearable at the same time. The trees did not know she was gone. They just kept doing what she had asked them to do from the beginning. I stood there longer than I meant to. That was when it started to pressure low and insistent somewhere behind my sternum. Not sharp enough to be alarming at first. I told myself it was the cold air, the early hour, the fact that I had skipped breakfast again. I told myself a lot of things in those first few seconds the way a man does when his body is saying something his mind is not ready to hear. I turned back toward the east barn, thinking I would sit down for a moment on the old bench just inside the door. I had sat on that bench 1,000 times after long harvests, after hard conversations, after the kind of days that leave a residue behind them. It seemed like the right place to let whatever this was pass through me. I made it about halfway. The pressure became something else entirely, a weight that had no business being inside a human chest, spreading outward in a way that stopped my feet and dropped me to one knee before I understood what was happening. I put my hand out instinctively and caught the corner of the barn wall. The wood was rough and cold under my fingers. I remember that clearly. I remember the smell of the soil, the sound of Ranger shifting in his stall somewhere behind me, the way the morning light had finally begun to crest the tree line. And I remember looking up just before everything went sideways and seeing the red roof of the house. Alton's roof, the one he built so a man could always find his way home. Then the ground came up to meet me, and the light went away, and I did not know anything at all. I do not know how long I was gone. The first thing I heard was humming. Not a song I recognized, just a soft, wandering sound, the kind a child makes when they are not trying to make music, but simply cannot help themselves. It moved through whatever fog I was still half buried in, and I followed it the way you follow a faint light at the end of a dark hallway, not because you know where it leads, but because it is the only thing in the dark that is moving at all. I became aware of other things slowly in pieces, the way a man comes back to himself after a long absence. A ceiling I did not recognize, white tiles, flat and indifferent with a thin crack running diagonally toward the far corner. A window somewhere to my left, letting in light that was too measured to be sunlight. The smell reached me next, antiseptic and recycled air, and the faint trace of something floral from a hand lotion or a cleaning solution, layered over the particular sterile quiet of a building that runs entirely on procedure rather than rhythm. My body registered all of it before my mind had fully caught up, the way the body always knows things first. I was not on the farm. I tried to move my right hand. It responded, but slowly, like a signal traveling a longer distance than it used to, like something in the wiring between intention and action had been partially interrupted. I turned my head toward the humming, and the effort of that small movement told me more about my condition than any doctor could have in that moment. Stella was sitting in the chair beside my bed. She had her shoes-off feet tucked underneath her the way she used to sit on the living room couch when she was 15 years old, and the whole world was still manageable. Missy was asleep across her lap, one small arm dangling loose at her side, fingers slightly open the way children sleep when they have not yet learned to hold on to things even in their rest. Stella was looking down at her daughter, still humming that quiet, shapeless melody, and for a long moment she did not notice I was watching her. When she looked up, everything she had been carrying for the past 4 days moved across her face, at once relief and exhaustion, and something else beneath both of those things, something careful and guarded that she was already working to keep out of her expression. She reached over and laid her hand on top of mine, without saying anything first. Just that, her hand on mine warm and steady, while the monitor beside me continued its quiet, indifferent rhythm. "Dad," she said finally. Just that one word, and her voice snagged on it like fabric on a nail. I tried to answer. What came out was not what I intended. The syllables arrived in the wrong order, my tongue moving a half-beat behind my thoughts, each word requiring a concentration that felt entirely disproportionate to the task of simply speaking. I had spent 70 years not thinking about how to form a sentence. The fact that I had to think about it now was in its own quiet way one of the more unsettling things I had ever experienced. How long I managed. Stella glanced at the door, a brief reflexive check, and then back at me. 4 days, she said. You had a stroke, Dad, a serious one. They found you by the east barn. Apparently, Hector came by to check on the irrigation line and saw you out there. She paused, and I could tell she had rehearsed. This part had decided how much to say and in what order. Doctor, Mercer says you're stable now. He says the fact that you're responding this clearly, that's a good sign. A real good sign. 4 days. I held that number, carefully turned it over. 4 days of that ceiling, that window that carefully measured light, and I had been nowhere for all of it. The farm had continued without me. The horses had needed feeding. Whatever weather had come through without me standing in it. And somewhere in those 4 days, decisions had been made and things had moved forward in ways I did not yet know about. I looked at Macy, still sleeping, her face completely unbothered by the weight of everything happening around her. There was something genuinely steadying about that. Children carry nothing forward from one moment to the next. They are entirely where they are. I used to think that was a limitation. Sitting in that hospital bed, I thought maybe it was the wisest thing in the world. Cody's, I said. The word came out cleaner than the others. Maybe because I had been moving toward it since the moment I understood where I was. Stella went still in a way that was different from ordinary stillness. She did not look away, did not reach for something to occupy her hands. She simply became careful the way a person becomes careful when they are deciding in real time how much of the truth the other person is ready to hold. He came the first 2 days, she said. He sat with you. He seemed... She chose her next word, the way you choose your footing on uncertain ground, distracted. Like he had somewhere else his mind needed to be. And then he stopped coming. I've called him. He picks up, tells me he's handling some things at the farm. Says he'll get back up here soon. She stopped. He hasn't. I did not respond. I let the information settle into me the way cold settles into old wood slowly and all the way through. Yet a nurse came in not long after. A woman somewhere in her mid-40s, with efficient hands and the particular calm of someone who had learned to deliver hard information without letting her own feelings get tangled up in the delivery. She checked the monitor, adjusted the drip line, asked me a short series of questions. My name, the date, whether I could track her finger with my eyes. I answered each one correctly, slowly but correctly, and she noted something on her clipboard with a small nod that I chose to interpret as encouraging. Before she left, I asked whether she had seen my son. She paused at the doorway, her hand resting on the frame. Mr. Harlow was here the first 2 evenings, she said, in the same even tone she used for everything else. We haven't seen him since Wednesday. No judgment in it, just the fact offered plainly, and then she was gone. I looked back up at the ceiling, the crack in the tile running toward the far corner, and I did not say anything more to Stella, who had gone back to her quiet humming, one hand resting gently on Macy's back. 4 days, 2 of them with Cody, then nothing. He's handling some things. I closed my eyes not from exhaustion, though the exhaustion was real and considerable, but because I needed the dark. Because some thoughts require a certain kind of quiet before they will take shape. And the thought that was forming in me now, slow and heavy as a stone turning over in deep water, was not one I was ready to speak out loud. Not yet. I had not been asleep, just drifting in that gray space between rest and wakefulness, where the mind moves slowly and without direction when the door opened. It was not the careful apologetic push of a nurse checking vitals. It was the door opening the way a door opens when the person on the other side has been traveling for a long time and is finally, after too many hours, somewhere they need to be. I turned my head before I had fully decided to. Griffin filled the doorframe for just a moment, tall still in his work clothes, a canvas jacket with road dust on the shoulders, and the particular worn-out look of a man who had driven through the night and not stopped long enough to think about what he looked like when he arrived. There was a crease on his left cheek from where he had probably rested his face against something in the car, pulled over somewhere on a dark stretch of interstate to close his eyes for an hour before pushing on. He looked like his mother used to look after a long day present, but depleted, running on something quieter than energy. He saw Stella first. She stood up so quickly that Macy stirred and made a small sound of protest before settling back against the chair cushion. Griffin crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled his sister into him, one arm around her shoulders, his chin coming down to rest on top of her head the way older brothers do when they are trying to hold something together without admitting that is what they are doing. Stella did not say anything. She just held on both hands, gripping the back of his jacket, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then Griffin stepped back, leaned down, and pressed a kiss to the top of Macy's head so gently that the child barely stirred. He smoothed her hair once with his thumb, a small, careful gesture that reminded me so completely of Loretta that I had to look away for a moment. When he turned to me, he took a breath first. Just a single breath, slow and deliberate, the kind a man takes when he is composing himself before he does something that requires his full attention. Then he came to the side of the bed and took my hand in both of his, not shaking it, not squeezing it hard, just holding it the way you hold something you are relieved to find still intact. Hey, Pop, he said quietly. I had not heard that word in months. He had a way of saving it for moments that mattered. I asked him how he had known. He pulled the chair a few inches closer to the bed and sat down on the edge of it, forearms on his knees, still holding my hand loosely between his. Horace Webb called me, he said, day before yesterday. Said you were in Boone County Hospital. Said Stella was with you, but that, he paused, and something moved through his expression that he redirected before it settled into anything readable, that there were some things at the farm that didn't look right to him. He didn't want to worry Stella any more than she already was, so he called me instead. Horace Webb. I had known Horace for going on 40 years. He ran the property 2 miles east of ours, a quiet, deliberate man who did not pick up the phone unless he had a reason to. The fact that he had called Griffin directly bypassing Stella, bypassing whatever normal channels a neighbor might use, told me something about what he had seen, or suspected. You stopped at the farm, I said. It was not a question. Griffin looked at me steadily. I did, he said. Dropped my bag, checked on Ranger, and the others made sure everything was running. And he was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who does not have an answer, but the quiet of someone who is deciding which answer to give and how much of it to offer in a hospital room, to a man still connected to monitors 3 days out from a serious medical event. And we'll talk about it, Pop, he said finally. We'll sit down and go through all of it, but right now, I need you to rest. Whatever is going on out there, he stopped, and in that pause I heard everything he was not saying. It's not going anywhere. It'll keep until you're stronger. I studied his face the way I had studied it his whole life, the way a father learns to read a child, not from what they say, but from the small geography of their expression. The set of the jaw, the tension just beneath the cheekbone, the way the eyes hold steady when the rest of the face is working hard to remain neutral. I had not seen his jaw that tight since the morning of Loretta's service when he had stood at the front of the church and read her favorite passage from memory without letting his voice break once. He had held himself together by sheer will that day, the same way he was holding himself together now. Whatever he had seen at the farm had done to him what very few things in his life had managed to do. He patted my hand, once stood up and moved to the window, looked out at whatever the parking lot below offered in the way of a view, his back to the room, his hands in his jacket pockets. Then he turned and settled into the chair beside Stella, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. And Stella looked at him. It lasted no more than 2 seconds, that particular kind of look that passes between two people who have already had a conversation and are now in the presence of a third party, silently confirming that they are still holding to whatever they agreed. Not alarm exactly. Something more controlled than alarm. Something that had already been processed and set aside and was now being kept carefully out of reach. I was supposed to be resting. My eyes were supposed to be closed. But I had spent 70 years reading the people I loved, and some things do not require your eyes to be open. I had seen it. The phone buzzed twice before Griffin pulled it from his jacket pocket and looked at the screen. Whatever he saw there made him stand up without a word. He held up one finger in my direction, the universal gesture for "give me a moment," and stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door most of the way shut behind him. I could hear the low register of his voice through the gap, but not the words themselves, just the cadence of it. And even that was enough to tell me the conversation was not a casual one. Stella had her eyes on the door too, though she was pretending to look at something on her lap. He was gone for maybe 4 minutes. When he came back, he was different. Not dramatically, Griffin had never been a man who wore his interior life on the surface. But I had known that face for 34 years, and there was a quality to it now that had not been there before he stepped out. A settling like a man who has just received the last piece of information he needed and is now deciding what to do with the complete picture. He looked at Stella briefly, then he looked at me. "Poppy," he said, "I need to tell you some things, and I need you to let me get through all of it before you say anything." I told him to go ahead. He sat back down on the edge of the chair, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, hands loosely clasped. He spoke carefully, not the careful of someone hiding things, but the careful of someone who has organized the information deliberately, who wants it to land in the right order, so that none of it gets distorted in the hearing. Horace Webb, he told me, had not just driven past the farm once. He had been keeping an eye on the property since the morning he found out I was in the hospital. That was the kind of man Horace was. He would never say that out loud, would never frame it as looking after anyone, but he had been making a point of coming down the county road that ran along our south fence line every day morning and evening. The way a man checks on something he feels responsible for without having been asked. 3 days ago, the day after I was admitted, Horace had come down that road and seen something that stopped him. 2 vehicles parked on the gravel pull-off just inside our south gate. Not farm trucks, not equipment rigs. Clean vehicles, the kind that do not belong on a working farm. One of them, a dark SUV, the other, a newer sedan with no mud on the wheel wells. And out in the south field, 2 men with equipment that Horace recognized as survey gear. Tripods, measuring rods, the kind of apparatus that means someone is calculating distances and drawing lines and deciding with official precision where one thing ends and another begins. Horace had pulled over. From the road, he could see a third man standing near the south fence line at the edge of the tree row. A man in a suit jacket and dark trousers, the kind of clothes that announce very clearly that the person wearing them did not come to work the land. And standing beside that man, pointing along the row of trees toward the creek bed at the far corner of the property, was Cody. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the ventilation running somewhere above the ceiling tiles. Horace didn't get close enough to hear most of it, Griffin said. But he caught a name. The man in the jacket introduced himself at some point. Horace thinks maybe to one of the survey crew, and the name was Brent Colby. Griffin reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, turned the screen toward me. There was a search result, pulled up a professional profile page, a headshot of a man in his late 40s, silver-haired, the kind of unremarkable face that belongs behind a conference table. Beneath the photo, a title and a company name. Brent Colby, Land Acquisition, AgriCorp Midwest Division. I looked at that name on the screen for a long moment without speaking. AgriCorp. I knew that name the way any farmer in this part of Iowa knew it, not personally, not from any direct dealing, but from the way you know a weather system that has been moving in your direction for years. They had been buying up land across 3 counties for the better part of a decade, consolidating small operations into industrial-scale holdings. And every farm that went into their portfolio came out the other side as something unrecognizable. Not a farm anymore, a unit of production, a line item. "There's more," Griffin said. He set the phone down on the bed rail and looked at me steadily. Horace heard a number. He said Colby mentioned it, while he and Cody were standing at the fence, said it clearly enough that Horace caught it from the road. I waited. $1,200,000, Griffin said, for the full 380 acres. I had been a farmer my entire adult life. I understood land values, understood the market, understood that numbers like that could sound large in the abstract, while meaning almost nothing against the actual weight of what was being exchanged. $1.2 million for land that my grandfather Alton had cleared by hand, that my father had worked through drought and debt and years that nearly broke him, that I had put 40 harvests into land, where Loretta had planted apple trees and called them magnificent before they had grown a single branch worth noting. The number did not feel like an offer. It felt like a verdict. I became aware slowly that the air in the room had changed. Not physically, the ventilation still ran, the monitor still kept its rhythm. The light through the window was the same flat evening gray it had been for the past hour. But something in the space between Griffin and me had shifted the way the atmosphere shifts in the hour before a serious storm, when the pressure drops and every living thing goes quiet without knowing why. Stella had stopped pretending to look at her lap. I looked at my son, at the set of his shoulders, at the careful steadiness he was maintaining, at everything he was holding back to keep this conversation from becoming something I could not manage from a hospital bed, and I understood that what Horace Webb had seen on that road was not the beginning of something. It was further along than that, further along than any of us had known to watch for. I took one slow breath, then another. "Bus, find out what your brother has already signed," I said. Morning came through the window, the way hospital mornings do. Not gradually, not with the slow build of light I had known every day of my life on the farm. but all at once flat and institutional, as if someone had simply turned a dial from dark to bright without bothering with the in-between. Stella had gone home the previous evening to get Macy into a proper bed and to pick up some things I needed. Griffin had stayed. He had pulled the recliner chair from the corner of the room, angled it toward the window, and slept in it the way soldiers sleep, not deeply, not comfortably, but reliably. Every time I had surfaced through the night, he had been there, one arm across his chest, boots still on. He was gone when I woke that morning. For about 20 minutes, I lay in the particular silence of an early hospital corridor, the distant sound of a cart rolling somewhere, a door closing 2 rooms down, the ventilation doing its steady, indifferent work above me, and I thought about the number $1,200,000. I thought about what it meant that Cody had been standing in our south field pointing at tree lines while I was in this bed. I thought about the question I had sent Griffin out with the night before, and I thought about what kind of answer a man gets when he goes looking for something he already on some level knows is there. The door opened at 8:15. Griffin came in carrying a manila folder, thick enough that it bent slightly under its own weight where he held it at his side. He was wearing a clean shirt. He had gone to the truck for his bag at some point, but his face carried the specific exhaustion of a man who had not actually rested, only changed clothes. He set a cup of coffee on my tray table without comment, pulled the chair up close, and sat down. He did not say good morning. He did not ask how I had slept. He just placed the folder on the bed beside my hand and looked at me with an expression that told me everything I needed to know before a single page was turned. I had seen that expression once before, the morning he had come to tell me that Loretta's test results had come back and the news was not good. The expression of a man delivering something he wishes he did not have to deliver, doing it anyway, because there is no one else, and because the truth, however heavy, belongs to the person it concerns. I opened the folder. The first document was 4 pages printed on standard white paper, with the heading of a notary office in Des Moines I did not recognize. I read the title at the top of the first page, slowly making sure I understood each word correctly. Power of attorney full and durable. I read further. The language was dense in the way legal documents are always dense, constructed to be precise, which in practice means constructed to be impenetrable to anyone without a law degree. But the essential meaning was not hard to find once you knew what you were looking for. The document granted its designated agent complete authority over all real property held under my name, the right to negotiate, the right to enter into agreements, the right to sign on my behalf in any transaction involving land structures or assets attached to the property. The designated agent was Cody. I turned to the signature page. My name was there. Eugene Harold Harlow in ink with the date printed beneath it 4 days after I had been admitted to Boone County Hospital. 4 days after I had been unconscious on the floor of the East Barn, unable to feed myself, let alone hold a pen. I stared at that signature for a long time. It was not entirely wrong. Whoever had produced it had done their homework, had studied my handwriting carefully enough to approximate the general shape and lean of it. The capital E had the right curve. The loop on the H was close, but the pressure was wrong. The way the letters connected was wrong. A man's signature is not just a pattern, it is a habit built over decades, and habits have a texture that cannot be fully copied by someone working from a sample. It was close enough to pass a casual inspection. It was not mine. Victor Hollis, Griffin said quietly as I turned back to the front page. He's an attorney out of Ames. Cody has been using him for about 8 months, near as I can tell. Hollis filed preliminary transfer documents with the county recorder's office 6 days ago, 3 days before you were even conscious enough to have a conversation. I set the papers down on the bed and looked at the wall. But how much time do we have? I asked. Griffin leaned forward. The preliminary filing creates a window, he said. It is not a completed transfer, not yet. But there is a response period, and once that closes, the process moves significantly faster and becomes considerably harder to contest. We are inside that window right now, but it is not a wide one. He paused. I called the county courthouse this morning before I came up, spoke to a clerk in the recorder's office. She told me what we needed to file and by when. I also left a message for a property attorney in Des Moines that Horace recommended a woman named Dale Pickett, who has handled cases like this before. Cases like this, I repeated. Griffin held my gaze without looking away. Yes, he said simply. I picked up the signature page again, held it closer than I needed to, the way you hold something when you're trying to understand it rather than just see it. My name in someone else's hand. 4 days after I had been lying in a field unable to call for help, the farm I had spent my life on had been quietly, methodically prepared for transfer to a company that would turn it into something Alton would not have recognized. Not by a stranger, by my son. Something happened in me then, not loudly, not with the heat of anger which burns fast and gives way to ash. Something slower than that, something that moved through me the way iron cools, losing its softness, degree by degree, until it becomes something that holds its shape against pressure. I set the page down carefully. Tell Dale Pickett I want to speak with her today, I said. Anne Griffin, whatever it takes. You understand me, whatever it takes. He looked at me for a moment, and something in his face settled a relief maybe, or a recognition. Then he nodded once. Yes, sir, he said. I do. Griffin had stepped out to make calls, and the room had settled into the particular quiet of a late afternoon, in a hospital that hour when the day shift begins winding down and the building takes on a slower, more deliberate rhythm, the urgency of morning rounds replaced by something closer to a held breath. I had been sitting with the folder closed on the tray table beside me, not reading it again, just aware of its presence the way you are aware of something that has permanently altered the landscape of a room. The documents were the same documents they had been an hour ago. The signature was still wrong. The date was still impossible. But something about having Griffin gone, about being alone with it in the quiet of that late afternoon light, made the weight of the whole thing settle differently lower and more permanent. I heard the knock before the door opened. Dr. Paul Mercer was a trim man in his early 60s with the kind of face that had probably looked steady and composed for so long that it had simply become that way permanently. He had the manner of someone who had learned over a long career that the most useful thing a doctor can sometimes do is sit down and speak plainly. He was not carrying a clipboard. He was not in a rush. He came in, closed the door behind him with a quiet click, and pulled the chair to the side of my bed with the deliberateness of someone who intended to stay long enough for the conversation to matter. Mr. Harlow, he said, I want to talk with you about something that is not strictly a medical matter, or rather it began as one, but it has become something larger. I told him to go ahead. He settled back in the chair, hands folded in his lap, and looked at me directly in the way that doctors look at you when they are not managing your expectations, but simply telling you something true. When a patient comes in with a neurological event of the severity you experienced, he said, part of my responsibility in the days that follow is to review not just the presenting condition, but the full picture vitals, medication levels, anything in the record that might inform how we understand what happened and how we proceed. I did that review for you, as I do for all my patients in this unit. He paused. What I found in your record gave me reason to take a closer look. I waited. Your sedation levels during the first 4 days of your admission were higher than what I would have prescribed for your condition, he said. Not dramatically so, not at a level that would trigger an automatic flag in routine monitoring, but measurably above what your neurological status required, enough to keep you in a significantly deeper state of sedation than was medically necessary. Enough that you would not have been capable of meaningful communication, of making decisions, or of giving informed consent to anything during that period. The late afternoon light lay flat, and even across the foot of my bed. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed. The ventilation ran its steady course above the ceiling. Someone adjusted your levels, I said. It was not quite a question. Dr. Paul Mercer held my gaze. The adjustments appear in the record, he said carefully. I am not in a position to tell you in this room exactly how or by whom. That determination requires a formal process. What I can tell you is that the pattern is not consistent with standard care protocol, and that I have a professional and legal obligation to report what I found. He let that land before he continued. There is a term for what the evidence in your record suggests, he said. When a vulnerable adult, and by legal definition, Mr., Harlow, a patient in your condition during those 4 days, qualified as a vulnerable adult. When someone in that position is deliberately kept in a state that prevents them from understanding or responding to what is happening around them, particularly in a context where decisions about their property or finances are being made, the law calls that elder abuse. Those two words sat in the room between us, like something solid. I had heard that phrase before, in the abstract, the way you hear about things that happen to other people in other circumstances, things that belong to a category of the world you assume will never intersect with your own life. I had always associated it with nursing homes, with strangers, with families I did not know. I had never once imagined sitting in a hospital bed in Boone County with a doctor using it to describe what had been done to me. I will be filing a report with Iowa Adult Protective Services, Dr. Paul Mercer said. That is not a decision I've made lightly, and it is not something I do without being certain of what the record shows. But the record shows what it shows, and my obligation to you and to the law is clear. He paused again. I want to make sure you understand what that means. An APS report initiates a formal investigation. It brings people into this situation who have authority and resources that go beyond what any individual can bring on their own. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, that means someone official is finally going to be involved. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite relief, not quite confirmation. Something quieter than either of those. He nodded once. Yes, he said. That is exactly what it means. He stood straight in the chair back to where he had found it and picked up the folder he had brought, but never opened his own notes, I assumed, or copies of what he had already filed. He paused at the door with his hand on the frame, the same way the nurse had paused 2 days ago, and looked back at me. Get some rest, Mr. Harlow, he said. You are going to need your strength. Then the door closed behind him, and the room was quiet again. I turned toward the window. The sky outside had gone the deep gray blue of early evening, the kind of color that in any other week of my life I would have watched from the porch with a cup of coffee, listening to whatever the fields had to say before dark. Instead, I was here in a bed I had not chosen, in a building that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, looking at a sky I could not walk under. And for the first time, not as a fear, not as a suspicion, but as a plain and settled fact, I understood that the morning I had walked out to the east barn and felt that pressure building in my chest had not simply been my body failing me. Someone had made a plan. They had needed me out of the way, and they had made sure I stayed out of the way. And then they had moved while the path was clear. I had not just been ill. I had been removed. The day Horace Webb came to see me, it was raining. Not the heavy, purposeful rain of a summer storm, but the slow, gray kind that settles in over Iowa in the in-between seasons, and simply stays the kind that does not announce itself, and does not apologize, just comes down steadily and makes the world outside a window look like something seen through old glass. I had been watching it for the better part of an hour when I heard the knock, and even before the door opened, I knew somehow that whoever was on the other side was not hospital staff. The knock was too unhurried, too comfortable with itself. Horace came in the way he did everything without ceremony, without particular urgency, as if arriving somewhere had never in his life been an occasion that required comment. He was carrying a thermos in one hand and his cap in the other, and he looked around the room once with the mild, appraising eye of a man who has walked into unfamiliar spaces his whole life and made himself at ease in all of them. He set the thermos on the tray table, hung his cap on the corner of the bed rail, and lowered himself into the chair beside me with the slow, deliberate movement of a man whose knees had earned their complaints. Brought coffee, he said. Hospital stuff tastes like something they mop the floor with. I told him that was the most accurate description I had heard all week. He poured 2 cups. He had brought a second one in his jacket pocket. A small ceramic mug with a chip on the handle that I recognized from his kitchen, and handed me one without asking whether I wanted it. That was Horace. He did not ask about things he already knew the answer to. We sat for a moment without speaking, the rain doing its quiet work on the window, the coffee warming my hands in a way that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the fact that someone had driven over just to bring it. I had known Horace Webb for the better part of 40 years. We had been neighbors before either of us had gray hair back, when both our operations were newer and leaner, and the work of building something was still mostly ahead of us. We had borrowed equipment from each other, traded labor during harvests, stood side by side at funerals for people we had both known too long and lost too soon. He had sat in the front row when we buried Loretta. He had not said much that day. Horace rarely did at the moments that mattered most, but he had been there, which was the thing that counted. "I expect you want to know what I saw," he said. "I expect you came here to tell me," I said. He nodded once and looked at his coffee cup for a moment. The way a man looks at something when he is putting his thoughts in order, rather than actually seeing it. "It started about 6 weeks before you went in," he said. "I noticed Cody's truck at odd hours, 2, 3 in the morning sometimes, coming up the drive, sitting a while, leaving before sunup. I did not think much of it at first, figured maybe he was having trouble sleeping, coming out to check on things. You know how I am about minding my own." I did know, which was exactly why, if Horace had eventually decided something was worth noting, it was worth noting. Then about 3 weeks before, he continued, "There was a car, dark sedan, newer model, no plates I recognized. It parked just off the county road near your south gate, not on your property, just off it, like whoever it was understood the difference. First time was a Thursday evening. Second time was maybe 10 days later, middle of the afternoon. Same car, same spot. Sat there the better part of an hour each time, then pulled away." He took a slow sip of coffee. "The third thing," he said, and his voice dropped slightly, not from emotion, but from the particular register a man uses when he is recounting something he wishes he had not heard, "happened about a week before your stroke. I was coming down the east fence line on foot, checking a section of wire that had been giving me trouble. Your feed barn sits close to the property line there, and I could hear voices from the back side of it before I saw anyone." He paused. "Cody was back there with a man I did not recognize. Younger fellow, dressed like he worked indoors. They were talking about timing, about when certain things needed to be in place. And at one point, the other man said something to the effect that by the time anyone thought to look twice, the situation with the old man would no longer be a factor." The rain moved against the window in a slow, steady sheet. I held my coffee cup and did not say anything for a moment. I let the words sit where they had landed, not reacting, not pushing back against them, just letting them find their true weight. "Well, with Horace," I said finally, "would you be willing to say that to an attorney?" He looked at me with the expression of a man who had come prepared for exactly that question and had already settled the answer long before he knocked on my door. "That is why I am here," he said simply. We sat with that for a moment. Then Horace reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small piece of folded paper. "Griffin called me 2 days ago," he said. "Asked me about a wooden box in the east barn. Said you had mentioned it once years back, and he thought you might want it accounted for." He set the paper on the tray table beside the thermos without unfolding it. He said he looked, but could not find it. I glanced at the paper, then back at Horace. Griffin was right to ask. That box had been sitting in the east barn for the better part of 12 years, in a spot I had chosen deliberately for exactly the kind of moment that, until recently, I had hoped would never come. It held things that mattered. Documents, records, a handwritten letter from Alton that I had kept, because certain things deserved to be kept, and 1 or 2 other items whose value was less sentimental and considerably more practical. I had never told anyone where it was. Not Griffin, not Stella, not Loretta, even though she likely would have found it eventually in her own quiet way. "A third board in from the east wall," I told Horace. "On the floor, not the wall. The nail heads are countersunk. You would not see the seam unless you were looking for it. Lift straight up." Horace took the folded paper, opened it, wrote something down in the unhurried hand of a man who has spent a lifetime making notes that needed to last, and folded it back up. "I will tell Griffin," he said. "I know you will," I said. The call came in the middle of the afternoon, while the last of the day's light was doing its slow work across the ceiling tiles above my bed. I had been trying to rest, not sleeping, just lying still with my eyes closed, which was the closest I had managed to actual rest in the better part of a week. The physical therapy team had come by that morning, walked me twice around the corridor, and declared themselves cautiously encouraged. My right side was responding better. My speech had smoothed out to the point where I no longer had to think about each word before it arrived. The body, it turned out, was more willing to come back than I had given it credit for. It was everything else that required more careful tending. When the phone buzzed on the tray table, I knew from the number it was Griffin. I answered before the second ring. "I found it," he said. Behind his voice, faint but unmistakable, the way sounds carry differently in old wooden structures, I could hear the particular groan of the east barn's side door swinging on its hinges. That door had needed adjustment for years. I had never gotten around to it the way you never get around to the things that are always exactly inconvenient enough to ignore. Hearing it now through a phone line from a hospital bed 40 minutes away produced in me a feeling I was not entirely prepared for, something between longing and relief. The way you feel when someone tells you a place you love is still exactly as you left it. "Tell me," I said. I heard him settling the soft compression of old wood under his weight, the creak of him crouching down. Then a stillness that told me he had the box open in front of him and was looking at what was inside before deciding how to describe it. "There's a document in here," he said slowly. "Heavy paper folded twice. It's old, the kind of paper that's gone a little yellow at the edges but held up. Looks like an original land certificate." A pause, and I could hear him unfolding it carefully, the way you handle something you understand to be irreplaceable. "Eugene Harold Harlow Sr., that's your grandfather. Alton, dated and recorded with Boone County. 380 acres, described by meets and bounds." Another pause. "Pop, this is the original. This is the document that started all of it." I knew what it was. I had read it so many times over the years that I could have described the shape of Alton's signature from memory, the long, deliberate loop of the capital A, the way the last letter of his name trailed off into a line that looked more like a horizon than a flourish. He had signed that document the same way he did everything, like a man who understood that what he was putting his name to would outlast him, and who wanted to make sure it looked like it meant something. "There's a second document," Griffin continued. "Handwritten. Looks like a boundary agreement, 2 signatures at the bottom, different handwriting, with a rough sketch of a fence line and a creek marker." He read me the names at the bottom. One of them was Alton's. The other belonged to a family whose farm had sat on our eastern border for 3 generations, before the last of them sold and moved to Minnesota sometime in the 80s. This would have been before any of the modern survey records, Griffin said. Before GPS coordinates and county plat maps. This is what people used instead. "Yeah, keep reading," I said. There was a brief silence, the kind that has texture to it, that is made of something more than just the absence of words. "There's a notebook," Griffin said. His voice had changed slightly. Not dramatically, but enough that I noticed it. A small adjustment in register, a careful neutrality that was doing some work to stay that way. "Small, blue cover, your handwriting." I did not say anything. "Should I?" "Go ahead," I said. I heard him turn the first pages, the soft sound of paper moving unhurried. "The first entry is about 2 years back," he said. "You wrote about a conversation at the kitchen table, Cody asking about the per-acre value of the South Field specifically. And you noted that he asked it twice, once directly, once as if it were a passing thought. You wrote, 'A man who asks the same question 2 different ways is looking for a particular answer.' I remembered writing that. It had been a Tuesday evening in late autumn, after the last of the harvest, when the house had that particular emptiness it gets between the end of work and the beginning of cold. Cody had stopped by, unannounced, which was not unusual for him, and we had sat at the table for an hour. Most of the conversation had been ordinary, but the question about the South Field had sat with me after he left. The way certain things sit with you, not because they are alarming, but because they do not quite fit the shape of everything around them. "There are other entries," Griffin said, turning pages slowly. 4 or 5 pages in you wrote about some loan documents that came to the house, addressed to Cody, care of your address, a creditor out of Des Moines. You wrote that you set them aside and did not open them, but that you noted the return address. He paused. Then, about 6 months before the stroke, you wrote that you had started keeping this record because you had a feeling you could not name and could not dismiss, and that if the feeling ever turned out to mean something, you wanted there to be a version of events written down in your own hand, while your memory of it was still clean. The light through the window had shifted while Griffin was talking, the way afternoon light shifts when it is preparing to leave the angles going softer, the shadows on the floor growing longer and less distinct. I had been staring at the ceiling without seeing it, listening to my own handwriting read back to me from 1,200 feet away. "Pop." "I'm here," I said. Griffin was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had come down to something quieter and more careful. The voice he used when he was saying something he had already turned over several times and was now finally ready to let out. "You already knew something was coming," he said. "Before any of this, before the hospital, before Horace, before any of it. You kept a record because some part of you already knew." I looked at the ceiling. I thought about that Tuesday evening at the kitchen table. The question about the South Field asked twice in two different ways. The notebook I had started not from certainty but from a feeling, the kind that does not announce itself loudly but simply refuses, no matter how many ordinary days pass over it, to go away entirely. "Dad," Griffin said softly, "you saw it coming. The hospital had a different quality at night. The daytime version ran on motion and noise carts and corridors, voices overlapping the building's constant low hum of purpose. But after 8 o'clock, it all pulled back like a tide going out, and what remained felt quieter and more honest, the way places become more themselves when the activity stops. The overhead light had been switched off. The lamp in the corner threw a narrow, warm circle across the foot of my bed. Griffin's chair, and the far corner where Macy had fallen asleep with markers scattered across her lap, and a half-finished drawing still loosely held in one hand. Griffin had the notebook open across his knees. He had not asked whether I wanted him to read it. He had simply waited until the room was quiet and Stella had stepped out, and then he had opened to the first page, looked at me once, a look that was a question without being a question, and I had nodded, and he began. My own handwriting read back to me in my son's voice. There is something disorienting about that, hearing words written in private, in the specific silence of a house at night, when you are the only one awake. Writing like that is unguarded in a way conversation never quite manages. You are not performing for anyone. You are just trying to find out what you actually think. Griffin read slowly and without comment. He let the words arrive in the room without shaping them toward any reaction, and I was grateful for that. The early entries were tentative. I had written about a change in Cody that I could feel but not name a new precision in his questions. When the subject turned to the farm, a quality of attention that had not been there before. I wrote about the loan documents that came in the mail over 8 months, 3 of them from 2 different creditors in Des Moines, addressed to Cody at my address. I had set them aside without opening them. I wrote that I did not feel I had the right to open them, and did not feel I had the right to pretend I had not seen them, and that the unease had taken root in the space between those 2 things. I remembered the night I had written that. Cold late in the year, wind coming off the fields with that dry edge it gets before the ground freezes. I had been sitting at the kitchen table with tea gone lukewarm, and the house had felt the way it feels when it is larger than your company requires. Griffin turned a page. The middle entries were where the tone shifted. I had written about a phone call I had overheard, not intentionally, just the coincidence of being on the wrong side of a door at the wrong moment. Cody's voice clipped and businesslike in a way that was not how he talked to family, using language about assets and timelines that sounded borrowed from people who did things with other people's land for a living. I had walked away without letting him know I was there. I had thought about it for 3 days before writing it down. Then Griffin read the line. I remembered most clearly. I keep telling myself I'm an old man reading too much into ordinary things. I keep telling myself a son does not do what I'm afraid he might be doing. But the feeling does not go away. It just waits. Griffin stopped. He did not turn the page. He held the notebook open in his hands and looked at me, and the room was very quiet, and neither of us said anything. Then from the corner, a small rustling. Macy had half woken that soft, in-between place where children look around without fully understanding what they are seeing. She blinked at the 2 of us in the lamplight, then looked down at the drawing in her hand with the focused seriousness of a child who knows exactly what she has made. She held it out toward me. I took it with my stronger hand. A red barn, a house with a pointed roof colored carefully inside the lines. and in front of the house, a stick figure in a hat, drawn with the confident simplicity of someone who had no doubt the recipient would know exactly who it was meant to be. I looked at it for a long time. She had gotten the barn color right. She had gotten the roof right, the same pointed shape Alton had built, the same shape I had looked at from every direction on that land for as long as I could remember. And the little figure standing in front of all of it with stick arms and a round head and a hat was unmistakably me, still there, still standing in front of my farm. Something in my chest that had been held very tight for a very long time came loose. It did not announce itself. It was just a quiet giving way, the kind that happens when something has been braced against pressure so long that the muscles finally stop holding. What came out was not grief exactly and not relief exactly, but the thing that lives underneath both, the thing without a clean name. I did not make a sound. I just let it move through me, and out the way a man cries when he does not want to be consoled, when he only needs the thing to pass. Griffin did not reach over or offer a word. He sat where he was and let me have it. He had always known when to stay still. That was something he had gotten from his mother. After a while, it passed. Macy had drifted back to sleep, the drawing still loosely at her side. I set my hand back on the bed and breathed. Griffin closed the notebook carefully, the way you close something that has earned its handling. He held it a moment, then looked up at me. "We're going to bring it home, Pop," he said. "All of it." I heard Stella's footsteps in the corridor before the door opened. I had come to recognize the rhythms of this floor over the past week, the measured pace of nursing staff, the unhurried shuffle of visitors who had been here too many times to feel like guests, the particular quick step of someone carrying news they cannot quite contain. Stella's footsteps that morning had the last quality. She was not running, but she was moving with a purpose that had not been there the evening before. She came through the door with her phone held out in front of her screen, facing me the way people carry things they want you to see before they have to find the words to explain them. Her face told me everything in the half second before I could read anything on the screen, that particular combination of alarm and something else. Something that, in another context, might have been called vindication. The look of someone who has been worried in private for a long time and has just discovered that the world has finally caught up. "Dad," she said, "you need to see this." Griffin was already on his feet from the chair in the corner. He crossed the room and looked over my shoulder as Stella set the phone on the tray table and angled it toward me. The name at the top of the page was The Boone News-Republican. The byline read, "Dana Whitmore Staff Investigative Reporter." The headline in the kind of type size a local paper reserves for the stories it considers significant enough to stop people in their tracks. You read pattern of acquisitions, how one agricultural corporation reshaped 4 Iowa counties in less than 2 years. I read it slowly. My eyes were still not as fast as they had been before the stroke. They got tired quickly and the lines had a tendency to blur if I pushed too long, but I read it carefully. The way you read something that has your name in it, the way you read something you have been inside of without knowing the full shape of the thing. Dana Whitmore had done her work thoroughly. The article laid out what she had found over what must have been months of records requests, county filings, and conversations with families across the region. 23 farm properties across 4 Iowa counties acquired by AgriCorp, or its subsidiary holding companies, within a span of 22 months. Total assessed land value, at time of transfer, $14,500,000. The smallest parcel, 80 acres in Webster County. The largest, and here I had to set the phone down for a moment and look at the window, 380 acres in Boone County, listed as a preliminary transfer pending final documentation. Our farm, case number 23. But what Dana Whitmore had done that no county filing could do on its own was lay the cases side by side and let the pattern speak for itself. In 17 of the 23 transactions, there had been a family member carrying significant personal debt loans liens, or creditor judgments that had not been disclosed to other family members. In 15 cases, a power of attorney or an expedited land transfer document had been filed within 60 days of a family health crisis or legal dispute. In every single case, the transaction had moved faster than standard agricultural land sales in the county, typically moved sometimes within weeks of the initial contact from a representative of AgriCorp, or one of its affiliates. A man named Brent Colby appeared in the documentation of 11 separate transactions. Stella was watching me read. She had her arms crossed the way she holds herself when she is trying to stay steady, and I could see from the set of her shoulders that she had already read the whole thing at least once, and was now waiting to see how it landed for me. "People in the waiting room are talking about it," she said quietly. "I heard 2 women mention it before I even came back in. Someone printed it out." That detail settled into me in a particular way, a printed copy passing between hands in a hospital waiting room in Boone County. There was something about that image, the physical transfer of a piece of paper, the old-fashioned weight of it that felt more real than anything that moves across a screen. This was not a story running somewhere abstract. This was running here, in this building, in this community, among people who knew these roads and these fields and these family names. Griffin's phone buzzed on the chair behind him. He picked it up, looked at the screen, and his expression shifted in a way I had not seen in days, something loosening in it, something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. "Luther Bain," he said, glancing up at me. Luther Bain had been the pastor at First Methodist in Ogden for going on 22 years. He had presided over Loretta's service. He was the kind of man who understood with the quiet certainty of someone who had watched a community hold together and fall apart over many decades, exactly when it was time to make a phone call and when it was time to stay out of the way. Griffin stepped into the corner and answered. I could hear Luther's voice through the phone, not the words, just the tone, which was unhurried and deliberate and carried in it the particular warmth of someone calling, not because they had to, but because they had decided it was right. Griffin listened more than he spoke, nodding twice, and when he ended the call, he looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face since before any of this had begun. "He says the congregation wants to help," Griffin said, "however we need." The room was quiet for a moment after that. Stella had unfolded her arms. Masai was still asleep in the corner chair, unbothered by all of it, her markers lined up beside her in a row that made a kind of order out of the morning. I looked at the phone on the tray table at the headline at Dana Whitmore's name at the number 23. For the better part of 2 weeks, this had been a private matter, something happening to one family inside one set of walls on one piece of land. That was the way they had designed it. I understood now. Keep it quiet, keep it contained, move fast enough that no one outside the transaction had time to look at it sideways. But now someone had looked. And once a story like this finds daylight in a place like Boone County, it does not go back into the dark. "Good," I said. "Let people see it." The morning after the article ran, the hospital felt different. Not dramatically, the corridors still ran on the same schedule. The same carts rolled past at the same hours, the ventilation kept its indifferent rhythm above the ceiling tiles. But there was a quality to the air that had not been there before, a tension that a building absorbs from the people moving through it when something has shifted in the world just outside its walls. I noticed it in the way the nurses moved a little more deliberately than usual, in the way the aide who brought my breakfast did not make small talk the way she had every other morning. Griffin arrived at 9:30. He came in without the folder, without the thermos, without any of the props that had accompanied the harder conversations of the past week. Just himself, jacket on hands in his pockets, the look on his face of a man carrying something he had been turning over since before he went to sleep the night before. He sat down and got straight to it. "AgriCorp's legal team contacted hospital administration yesterday afternoon," he said, "after the article ran. I waited. They are contesting Dr. Mercer's report. Their position is that he exceeded his professional authority by making a determination that fell outside his direct clinical responsibilities, that a physician treating a stroke patient has no standing to characterize the circumstances of that patient's sedation as anything other than a medical matter." Griffin paused, and I could hear in the pause how carefully he had memorized this. "They have indicated they intend to file a formal complaint with the Iowa State Medical Board if the report is not withdrawn." I looked at the window. The sky outside was the flat, even gray of a day that had not decided what it wanted to do yet. A complaint to the State Medical Board. I understood what that meant, not necessarily in legal terms, but in practical human terms. It meant months of proceedings. It meant a man's career examined under conditions designed to make examination itself feel like punishment. It meant that even if every finding came back in his favor, the process of getting there would cost him something. Time, energy. The particular toll of having your professional judgment publicly questioned by people with the resources to make the questioning expensive. That was the point, of course. The complaint was never really about the outcome. It was about the cost of standing firm. What did Dr. Mercer say? I asked. Griffin looked at me with something that was almost but not quite a smile. I ran into him in the corridor this morning. He said, "Before I came in here, I told him what I had heard. I asked him directly whether the pressure from administration had changed anything about his position. And he said," Griffin paused not for effect, but because he was making sure he had the words right, "they can do whatever they feel they need to do. My report reflects what the record shows, and the record does not change because someone finds it inconvenient." He let that sit for a moment. Then he said the APS documentation had already been submitted and was in the hands of the investigating unit, and that he had made himself available to speak with their team directly whenever they needed him. Yes, I sat with that for a moment. I had known enough men over the course of my life to understand that there are two kinds of steady. The first kind looks steady from the outside, but has a negotiating point somewhere inside it, a threshold past, which it will find a reason to move. The second kind is steady, the way old timber is steady, not because nothing has pushed against it, but because what pushed against it only revealed what was already there. Doctor. Paul Mercer was the second kind. I had sensed it the afternoon he sat down in the chair beside my bed and used the words elder abuse without flinching. I had seen it in the way he delivered hard information, not as something he was doing to me, but as something he owed me. A man like that does not adjust his report because a corporate legal team sent a letter to hospital administration. The letter was not written for him. It was written for anyone around him who might be more easily moved. They are trying to make the people closest to this case feel like the cost of staying in it is too high, I said. Griffin nodded slowly. That is exactly what they are doing. It means we are getting somewhere, I said. People do not spend money pressuring witnesses when they are confident in their position. Griffin looked at me for a moment, and something in his face settled the particular settling of a man who has been carrying a weight alone and has just been reminded that he is not, in fact, carrying it alone. Outside in the corridor, two voices passed in conversation and faded down toward the nurse's station. The ventilation ran. The gray sky outside the window held its position without committing to anything. I thought about Dr. Paul Mercer standing in a hospital corridor that morning, being asked whether a formal threat from a corporation's legal team had changed his mind, and answering the way he had answered. Not with anger, not with defiance, which would have been the easier and louder thing, just with the plain, unhurried statement of a man who has already decided where he stands and does not find the question particularly complicated. That kind of steadiness costs something to maintain. It always does, and it deserved to be acknowledged. Tell Dr. Mercer I said thank you, I said. Tell him I mean it. Griffin nodded, once stood up and reached for his jacket on the back of the chair. I will, he said. He'll appreciate hearing it. The hospital at 2 a.m. is the quietest version of itself. The corridor outside my door had gone down to a single pair of footsteps every 20 minutes or so, a nurse doing rounds, moving with the practiced near silence of someone who has learned to do their work without disturbing the thin layer of rest that a hospital night makes available. The monitors ran. The ventilation ran. The window showed nothing but the reflected glow of the parking lot lights against the dark, and I had been lying in that specific wakeful stillness that comes when the body is tired, but the mind refuses to follow it down. When the phone lit up on the tray table, I saw the name before I heard the sound. Cody. I looked at it through 2 full rings. Not because I was deciding whether to answer. I think some part of me had been waiting for this call since the moment I understood what had been happening, but because I wanted to be still for a moment before I was not. Then I picked it up. Pop. His voice was different. I had known Cody's voice for 51 years, had heard it as a child, calling across a field, as a teenager, pushing back against whatever boundary I had set that week, as a grown man at his most careful and at his most careless. I knew the particular register he used when he wanted something, the one that was a degree or two more relaxed than his natural voice, measured and unhurried in a way that was actually a form of effort. That voice was not what I heard now. What I heard was what was left when that voice was gone. "I know it's late," he said. "I'm awake," I said. A pause. I heard him breathe not steadily the way a man breathes when he is composed, but with the irregular rhythm of someone who has been holding something for a long time and is standing at the edge of putting it down. "I'm sorry," he said. I did not respond. I waited. "I know that doesn't cover it," he continued. I'm not calling because I think saying it makes it okay. He stopped, and I heard him collect himself, the way a man does when emotion gets ahead of his intention. "I needed you to hear it from me directly, not through lawyers, not through Griffin, from me." "Go ahead," I said. And he did, haltingly at first then, with the momentum of someone who had rehearsed this, and then abandoned the rehearsal halfway through because the rehearsed version felt like another kind of dishonesty. He told me about the debt, $340,000, accumulated over the better part of 4 years through a casino operation out near Tama that had started as something manageable and become something else entirely. He told me about the creditors, not a bank, not an institution with a process and a timeline, but the kind of arrangement that creates its own timeline and its own process. The kind where the people on the other side of the debt do not send letters. He told me he had been carrying it alone, that he had been ashamed of it in the specific way a man is ashamed of something he cannot explain, without also explaining who he had let himself become. And then he told me about Agricorp. "They found me," he said. "I need you to understand that. I did not go looking for them. A man named Brent Colby called me on a Tuesday afternoon. He already knew about the debt. He already knew the number, who it was owed to, how long it had been sitting there. And he said he had a solution that would make it go away and leave me with enough left over to start clean." I looked at the dark window, the parking lot glow, the still reflection of a room I had been living in for too many days. "He came to you because you were useful to him," I said. "Yes," Cody said quietly. "And you let him?" A long silence. Not the silence of someone who has no answer, but the silence of someone who has the only answer there is, and has to decide whether to give it. "Yes," he said again. I lay there in the dark of a hospital room in the middle of the night, listening to my son breathe on the other end of a phone line, and I thought about what it cost a man to make that admission. Not the legal cost, not the practical cost. Those were coming regardless. And Cody knew it as well as I did. The other kind of cost. The kind that does not appear in any filing and cannot be negotiated or settled or reduced. The kind that a man pays to himself in the accounting that happens in the hours before sleep, when there is nothing left to hide behind. I did not feel what I might have expected to feel. There was no heat in me, no rush of the anger that had been building since the morning Griffin had laid those documents across my hospital bed. What I felt was older and quieter than anger. The particular grief of a parent who has watched a child make a choice that cannot be unmade, and who understands that love and consequence are not opposites, that sometimes the most loving thing is to let the consequence stand. I asked him one question. "When you were standing in that south field with Brent Colby pointing at the tree lines, did you think about what that land means? Or did you only think about what it was worth? Ekasestridis obam meo bosezir." The silence that followed was the longest of the call. I did not fill it. I let it be as long as it needed to be, because the question was not rhetorical and did not deserve to be treated like one. He did not answer. The call stayed open. I could hear his breathing slow, uneven, the sound of a man sitting somewhere in the dark on his end of a long distance, holding a phone and not finding the words, or finding them and understanding that they would not be enough. After a while, the call ended. I set the phone face down on the tray table and looked at the ceiling. The crack in the tile was still there, running toward the far corner, unchanged by everything that had happened in this room. 3 days after Cody's call, the morning came, in sharp and clear. Not the soft, tentative light of the days before those gray Iowa mornings that could not quite commit to themselves, but the hard, flat brightness of a sky that had decided to be cold and direct about it. It came through the window at an angle that reached further across the floor than usual, and I had been sitting up in bed, watching it move when Griffin called. He did not open with a greeting. He opened with, "Something has happened." I had learned over the course of this particular stretch of my life to measure Griffin's delivery the way a farmer measures weather, not just by what was being said, but by the barometric quality underneath it. The words "something has happened" could cover a wide range of territory. What told me where on that range we were sitting was the particular steadiness in his voice, the kind that sounds calm because the person speaking has already processed the shock and is now simply reporting. This was not bad news. "Brent Colby reached out," Griffin said. I stayed quiet and let him continue. He had not reached out directly, not to Griffin, not to Dale Pickett's office, not through any channel that could be traced back to him in a straightforward way. He had used an intermediary, a former colleague who now worked in commercial real estate in Des Moines, and who had made contact with Dale Pickett's paralegal through what was described as an informal inquiry. The careful indirection of it told its own story. Brent Colby was not a man acting from principle. He was a man acting from fear, and he was constructing as much distance as possible between himself and the act of cooperating in case he needed to deny it later. But what he had sent through that intermediary was not nothing. "A USB drive," Griffin said, "delivered by hand to Dale Pickett's office yesterday afternoon. She called me last night after she had gone through it. What was on it?" Griffin took a breath, the kind that precedes a list of things that hold weight. "Internal communications," he said. "Emails, internal memos, what looks like a directive document that came down from AgriCorp's Regional Acquisition Office. Dale says it goes back almost 3 years. There are targeting criteria, specific financial indicators they use to identify farm properties where a family member was carrying debt or facing legal pressure. The directive instructs acquisition representatives to make initial contact only after those conditions were confirmed." I looked at the window. The hard morning light lay across the floor without apology. "They were not finding vulnerable families by accident," I said. "No," Griffin said. "They were looking for them, systematically." He went on. "Among the internal communications on the drive were emails that referenced our property specifically, not in the weeks before my stroke, not in the month before, but in correspondence dating back, the better part of 14 months. Our farm had been identified, evaluated and flagged inside AgriCorp's acquisition pipeline long before Brent Colby had ever parked a sedan on the county road near our south gate. Long before, Cody had received a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon from a man who already knew the size of his debt. The timeline of it settled into me with a particular kind of weight. 14 months. While I had been walking my fields, feeding the horses, pressing my palm flat against the soil, the way my father had taught me. While I had been sitting at a kitchen table, writing careful notes in a small blue notebook about a feeling I could not name, they had already been moving. Patient, methodical, working through a checklist that had been drawn up in an office somewhere by people who had never set foot on the land they were cataloging. "There's one more thing," Griffin said. "Go ahead." "Kevin Marsh. He's a loan officer at Boone County Bank, has been there about 12 years. Dale Pickett's office reached out to him as part of the document review, and he called back within the hour." Griffin paused. "He said that when the POA-backed transfer paperwork came through his branch for processing, he flagged it internally. He noted the timing the document being signed while you were hospitalized, and he wrote it up as a transaction requiring additional verification. And his branch manager told him to process it anyway, said the paperwork was in order, and that the branch did not have standing to hold a legally executed document on the basis of an employee's personal reservations." Another pause. "Kevin Marsh kept a copy of his original flag report. He still has it, and he is willing to say on the record that he raised the concern and was told to set it aside." I thought about Kevin Marsh sitting in a bank office in Boone County, looking at a document that did not sit right with him writing up a report that he already suspected would go nowhere, and keeping a copy of it anyway. The quiet, undramatic act of a man who did not know if his concern would ever matter, but who decided to preserve it just in case. There was something in that. I recognized the same instinct that had made me start a notebook 2 years ago, in a kitchen I thought was empty of everything except my own unease. Sometimes the only thing you can do in the moment is keep the record clean and trust that the moment will eventually arrive when someone needs to read it. Griffin let the silence sit for a beat, then said what we were both already thinking. "We have everything we need, Pop." I leaned back against the pillow. The hard morning light had moved further across the floor. While we had been talking, the way light moves when you are not watching it steadily without announcing itself, until suddenly it is somewhere it was not before. "Yeah, then it's time to move," I said. Griffin called from the parking lot at 7:30. I heard the engine of his truck still ticking as it cooled in the background, and behind that, faintly, the sound of voices and the particular acoustics of a building with too many people in it, that warm, overlapping hum that a crowd makes when it is gathered around something that matters to it. He had pulled over just outside the entrance of First Lutheran Church of Ogden and was calling before he went in, the way a man calls when he wants to share something before it becomes a memory. "The lot is full," he said. "There are trucks parked out on the grass." I settled back against the pillow and held the phone against my ear. Outside my window, the night was quiet and unremarkable, the same flat dark it had been every other night of this hospital stay. But on the other end of that phone line, something was happening that I was not going to be present for. And Griffin understood, without being asked, that the least he could do was hold the phone up so I could hear it. He walked in with the call still open. The sound changed when he went through the doors. The hum sharpened, gained texture and direction, became the sound of individual conversations layered over each other in a wood-paneled room built for a congregation a fraction of this size. Griffin said nothing for a moment. He just let me hear it. Pews filled past capacity-folding chairs set out along the side walls. People standing in the back with their coats still on because there was nowhere to put them and no reason to leave. Muk-Su, Luther Bain, opened the meeting the way he opened everything, with a prayer that was neither long nor performative, the kind that says what it needs to say and then steps out of the way. I could not make out the words clearly through the phone, just the cadence of it, the rise and fall of a voice that had been doing this long enough that it no longer needed volume to carry weight. When he finished, there was a brief, genuine quiet in the room, the kind that follows something that has been heard rather than just listened to. Then the room opened up. Griffin held the phone steady and let it come to me in pieces. A man from a farm out near Beaver Creek, he had signed papers he did not fully understand after his wife had been hospitalized, and the bills had stacked up faster than the harvest could answer them. A woman from the south end of the county, whose father had handed over a land transfer under what she now understood had been manufactured urgency, a deadline that turned out not to be a deadline at all. Two brothers from outside Pilot Mound, whose family operation had been the 14th of the 23 they had driven past their old fence line last week, they said, and the signage was already changed. Each voice carried something different. Some carried anger, which was clean and useful. Some carried grief, which was older and less organized, but no less real. A few carried something quieter than either the particular exhaustion of people who had been trying to make sense of what happened to them in private and had just for the first time walked into a room full of people who already understood without needing the story explained. At some point, Griffin started moving through the room, and the voices came and went as he did, fragments of conversation, the scrape of a chair, the sound of a hand on a shoulder. I lay in a hospital bed 40 minutes away and listened to my county put itself back together piece by piece. Near the end of the evening, Griffin went still. I heard his breathing slow, in the way it does when he is paying close attention to something. An older voice from somewhere near the front of the room. Unhurried and deliberate, the kind of voice that belongs to a man who has learned that he does not need to be loud to be heard. "I've known Eugene Harlow going on 30 years, the voice said, "and I can tell you that man has shown up for this county more times than most of us have thought to count. He showed up when the grain co-op was going under. He showed up after the flood in '93. He showed up at every meeting, every harvest, every funeral for someone who farmed this land and loved it the way it deserves to be loved." A pause. "Eugene can't be here tonight, so tonight we show up for him. That's how this works. That's always how it's worked." The room responded in the way rooms respond when something true has been said, plainly not with applause exactly, but with a collective sound that is the human equivalent of a nod, the sound of recognition moving through a group all at once. Griffin said my name quietly into the phone. Just pop in a voice that told me he already knew I had heard it and did not need him to confirm that it had landed. I did not trust myself to say anything for a moment. By the end of the evening, a legal fund had been established. $120,000 committed by more than 200 people before the folding chairs were put away. Some had given what a working farm family can spare on a Thursday night in the middle of a difficult season, which is not nothing, and which means something different than a larger amount from someone for whom it costs less. Griffin read me the total from a notepad someone had handed him at the door on the way out, his voice carrying the careful flatness of a man keeping his own feelings out of the way of the information. 120, he said, and they're still calling in. I thought about those 200 people, their names, their faces, their farms, the specific texture of what it had cost each of them to write down a number and hand it to someone at the door of a Lutheran church on a cold Thursday evening. I thought about the old farmer at the front of the room, who had stood up without being asked, and said the thing that needed to be said. Griffin, I said, yeah. When you have the list of names, every single one of them, I want to thank them personally. By name, each one, a pause. I'll get you the list, he said. The list of names was still on the tray table when Cody appeared in the doorway. Griffin had dropped it off that morning, 3 pages handwritten in 2 different hands, where someone had taken over partway through every name from the meeting at First Lutheran accounted for. I had been reading through it slowly, the way you read something you intend to treat carefully, when I looked up and saw him standing there. He had not knocked. He was just there the way people sometimes are when they have been standing at a threshold long enough that the act of knocking has become its own kind of delay. He was in a jacket I recognized dark blue, the one Loretta had given him years ago, that he had never quite stopped wearing, and he looked like a man who had not been sleeping well, which I understood, and who had driven here without entirely deciding what he was going to say when he arrived, which I also understood. We looked at each other across the length of the room. I did not say come in. I did not say anything. I just held his gaze, and after a moment he stepped through the door and pulled it closed behind him. He stood near the foot of the bed for a moment, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the floor the way a man looks at the floor when he is composing himself, and does not want the other person to watch him do it. Then he looked up, and he came around to the side of the bed, and he did not take the chair. He sat on the edge of the mattress instead, on my left side, close enough that I could have reached him without stretching, the way he used to sit when he was small and had come to find me after a bad dream, or after something at school had gone sideways, and he needed to be near something that felt solid before he could talk about it. I had not thought about that in years. The memory arrived without warning the way the oldest ones do. I talked to Victor Hollis, he said, without looking up. He told me to contest everything, said we had procedural grounds, said the timeline on the APS report could be challenged, said Dale Pickett's documentation had gaps that a good attorney could work. A pause. He had a whole strategy laid out. And I said, Cody looked at me then, and I told him I wasn't going to do it. I waited. I told him to stand down, he said. Whatever needs to happen legally, whatever the process is, I'm not going to be the one fighting it. I'm done fighting it. He said this without drama, without the kind of declaration that is really a performance of remorse rather than the thing itself. He said it the way a man states a decision he has already made and does not need to revisit. Then he said, I'm sorry, Pop. The words were plain and direct, and they carried in them the weight of someone who had not reached them easily. I had heard Cody apologize over the course of his life for the ordinary things, missed calls, broken commitments, the small failures that accumulate in any relationship between a parent and a grown child. Those apologies had always come with a certain ease, a fluency that was in itself a small warning sign, though I had not always read it that way at the time. This was not that. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said it again. I'm sorry. The second time was different from the first, slower, without the forward momentum of someone moving through a prepared statement, more like a man returning to something, because he had not fully said it the first time, and knew it, I looked at him sitting on the edge of my bed in his mother's jacket with the particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally set it down. Not because the weight is gone, but because he has stopped pretending it is not there. He said it a third time. Not as repetition, but as arrival, the way you say something the third time when the first two were practice, and you have finally found the form the words need to take. I know what I did, he said. I know what it cost you. I know what it cost the farm. And I know that me saying sorry in a hospital room doesn't fix any of it. I did not tell him that it was all right because it was not all right, and he was not asking me to say that it was. I did not tell him I forgave him, because forgiveness is not a thing that happens in a single moment in a hospital room, and anyone who tells you otherwise has never had to forgive something that actually mattered. What I did was reach over and place my hand on his forearm. He looked down at it. Then he placed his hand on top of mine carefully, the way you place something you are not sure you have the right to touch. And we sat like that without speaking. Outside the window, the afternoon had gone, the soft, diffuse gray of a day winding down toward evening. The monitors ran. The ventilation ran. The list of names lay on the tray table where I had left it. None of it required anything from us, and we did not offer anything to it. We just sat in the particular quiet of two people who have a long history between them that cannot be resolved in an afternoon, but can perhaps be acknowledged in one. I did not know what came next for Cody. I did not know what the legal process would ask of him or take from him, and I was not going to think about that today. Today there was only this room, and this quiet, and my son's hand on mine. After a while he stood up. He pulled his jacket straight the way a man does when he is preparing to go back out into the world. And he looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face since he was very young, open in a way that cost him something unguarded, in a way that the years had mostly trained out of him. "I'll be in touch," he said. I nodded. He walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out into the corridor. I watched him go, his shoulders, his walk, the particular way he moved that I had known since he first learned to move at all. And just before he turned the corner and disappeared from sight in the half-second, when the distance made him smaller and the hallway light fell across him at that particular angle, something shifted in my vision. For just a moment, one brief, unreasonable, entirely real moment, I did not see the man who had done what he had done. I saw the boy he used to be. If this moment between the father and son left a deep impression on you, leave a comment and let me know you're still watching. A small note. The story ahead contains some fictional elements created for storytelling purposes. If you don't like this topic, you can skip now. If you're still watching, let's continue. The air outside smelled like rain that had not arrived yet. It was the first time I had been outdoors in close to 3 weeks, and the difference between the recycled temperature-controlled air of the hospital and the raw, unsettled air of an Iowa morning was enough to stop me for a moment at the top of the ramp. Not from weakness, though. I was still weaker than I intended to stay, but from the simple physical fact of being outside again, under an actual sky, with actual weather moving across it. Griffin paused behind the wheelchair, without being asked the way he had learned over these past weeks, to read when I needed a moment, and when I needed to keep moving. I took a breath that tasted like October and wet soil, and the particular mineral edge the air gets in this part of the state when a front is coming through. Then I told him I was ready, and he wheeled me toward the entrance of the Boone County Courthouse. The building was the same one it had always been, limestone facade, broad steps that the wheelchair ramp curved around at the side. The kind of architecture that was built to communicate permanence and had succeeded at it for the better part of a century. I had been inside it twice in my life before today. Once for a boundary dispute my father had handled when I was in my 20s, and once for a water rights matter that had taken 2 years to resolve and had taught me more about patience than I had wanted to know. I had never imagined a third visit would concern my own name on a transfer document I had never signed. The courtroom was fuller than I expected for a civil proceeding. They were not there because they were required to be. The rows behind the rail held farmers and neighbors, and people from the meeting at First Lutheran People, who had driven in on a Wednesday morning because they understood, without being told, that some things deserve a witness. I recognized faces as Griffin wheeled me to the plaintiff's table. Horace Webb in the third row, hands folded back straight, giving me a single nod when our eyes met. A few of the families whose stories I had heard through a phone line from a hospital bed now present in person, occupying the same room where the outcome of their own situations might eventually be shaped by what happened today. Dale Pickett was already at the table. She was a compact, precise woman in her early 50s who moved through the mechanics of a courtroom, the way experienced people move through any environment they know thoroughly, without wasted motion, without performance, with the quiet confidence of someone who has done this enough times that the setting itself holds no surprises for her. She had reviewed everything: the medical records, the APS documentation, the USB contents, Horace's written statement, Kevin Marsh's flag report, and the notebook, and she had told Griffin the week before that she had rarely walked into a civil case with a more complete factual record. Victor Hollis sat at the opposite table. He was younger than I had imagined, from the description mid-30s, well-dressed, with a polished bearing of someone trained to project certainty regardless of his actual position. He had prepared arguments. He presented them methodically. The document bore a valid notary seal. The signature had passed initial bank verification. There was no direct evidence of coercion at the moment of signing. He was doing the job he had been hired to do, and he was doing it competently, and none of it was going to be enough. The judge was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a cord around her neck, and the unhurried manner of someone who had long since stopped being impressed by anything that happened in his courtroom and had settled into the more useful posture of simply listening carefully. She listened to Victor Hollis without interruption. She asked 3 questions, each of them precise, and pointed in a way that told me she had already read the filings thoroughly and was testing specific gaps rather than gathering general information. Then she heard from Dale Pickett's side. "Doctor, Paul Mercer testified to the sedation levels, the same information he had given me in that hospital room weeks ago, now delivered under oath, in the plain and steady voice of a man who had already made peace with whatever professional consequences might follow, and had decided that the record mattered more." Horace Webb took the stand and described what he had seen from the county road, the sedan, the survey equipment, the conversation behind the feed barn, all of it the same as he had told me over coffee in my hospital room, but formal now, on the record, undeniable. Dale Pickett presented the USB contents last, the internal AgriCorp communications, the targeting criteria, the emails referencing our property 14 months before my stroke. She walked through them methodically, document by document, and the courtroom was very quiet while she did it. Victor Hollis made his closing argument. It was shorter than his opening. The judge did not deliberate at length. She looked at her notes, she looked at the record, and then she looked up and spoke in the measured, unhurried tone she had used for everything else, as if the weight of what she was saying did not require a different register. Because the facts had already done the heavy work, and the words were just the formal acknowledgement of what the evidence had established. The power of attorney was invalid, signed under conditions that legally precluded informed consent. The preliminary land transfer filed with the county recorder was void. All associated documentation was to be considered null. The property, 380 acres in Boone County, Iowa, described by metes and bounds, was to be recorded in its original ownership under the name of Eugene Harold Harlow. The room did not erupt. What happened instead was quieter, and I thought more suited to the people in it. A single pair of hands began to clap slowly, deliberately from somewhere in the middle rows. Then another pair joined, then another and another, spreading through the room, the way things spread through communities that have learned to move together, not in a rush, but steadily. Each person adding their part when they were ready until the whole room was in it. I sat in the wheelchair with my hands on the armrests, and I let it wash over me, the sound of it, the weight of it, the improbable and entirely real fact of it. Then I exhaled. 380 acres, my grandfather's land, my father's land, mine, still mine. 2 weeks home, and I was still learning how to be in the house again. Not in the practical sense, the routines had come back faster than I expected, the body remembering what the mind sometimes forgot, hands finding their way to the coffee pot and the boot rack and the latch on the back door without being asked. But there was another kind of reacquaintance happening underneath the practical one, slower and less straightforward. The house felt the same and different at once, the way a place feels when you have been away long enough that you have stopped taking it for granted, when you have had cause to understand that the possibility of losing it was real and present and very nearly came to pass. I had been sitting on the porch for the better part of an hour when Griffin called. The morning was cool and still the kind of Iowa fall morning that arrives clean and unhurried, with a sky so flat and blue it looks painted. The fields had been turned under for the season. Hector and his crew had seen to that in my absence, quietly, without being asked twice, and the land lay open and dark and patient, the way it does when it is waiting for what comes next. The apple trees at the northwest corner were bare now, their branches making the particular spare geometry of late autumn, and I had been looking at them when the phone buzzed on the rail beside me. "It's done," Griffin said. I did not ask him to explain. I just listened. The criminal proceedings had moved separately from the civil case, a different courtroom, a different process, built on the investigative work that Detective Hank Dorsey of the Boone County Sheriff's Office had been quietly assembling for the better part of 3 months. Griffin had told me about Hank Dorsey 2 weeks earlier, a methodical man in his late 40s who had, according to Dale Pickett, the useful quality of not being in a hurry and not being easily redirected once he had decided something was worth following. The USB contents the APS documentation, Kevin Marsh's preserved flag report, and Horace Webb's formal statement had given him what he needed to build a case that moved beyond the civil question of the land and into the harder territory of intent. Cody had pleaded guilty that morning. Griffin said it plainly without softening it, which was the right way to say it. The court had accepted the plea. The sentence was 18 months. With the reduction reflecting 2 things: the cooperation Cody had provided to Detective Hank Dorsey's investigation in the weeks following his visit to my hospital room, and the evidence he had ultimately supplied that had helped establish the broader pattern of AgriCorp's operations across the 4-county region. 18 months. I held the number carefully, the way you hold something you're not sure how to feel about something that is simultaneously too much and not enough, depending on which direction you approach it from. The regional director, Griffin continued, AgriCorp Midwest Division. "Tell me," I said, "federal wire fraud charges filed by the U.S. Attorney's office based in Des Moines, grounded in the pattern of interstate financial transactions that Brent Colby's USB had documented across all 23 acquisitions." The regional director, whose name I had never learned until Griffin said it now, a man who had signed off on targeting criteria and acquisition directives from behind a desk in a city that had never seen our fence lines, was facing charges that carried consequences considerably more serious than 18 months. The branch manager at Boone County Bank, who had overridden Kevin Marsh's concern, was under active investigation by the Iowa Division of Banking. Kevin Marsh himself had been formally cleared of any professional wrongdoing. His original flag report entered into the official record as evidence of due diligence properly exercised and improperly dismissed. Griffin said Dale Pickett had called Kevin Marsh personally to tell him, and that the man had apparently gone very quiet on the phone for a moment before saying, "Thank you." I understood that quiet. Victor Hollis, I said, surrendered his Iowa law license voluntarily, Griffin said, pending disciplinary review. Dale says voluntary surrender usually means a man has looked at what's coming and decided it's easier to step out than to be pushed. I thought about Victor Hollis assembling his strategy in that courtroom, the notary seal, the signature verification, the procedural arguments, and I thought about the fact that a man can be technically skilled at his work and still be using that skill in the service of something that will eventually, in one form or another, come back to him. The law has a long memory for the people who use it as a tool against the people it was built to protect. The wind moved through the apple trees at the corner of the orchard. The bare branches shifted and settled, shifted and settled. Somewhere past the south fence, a crow made a sound and went quiet. The same crow, maybe, or one very like it, that I had heard on the morning I had walked out into the fields before everything changed. Griffin stayed on the line for a while, after that not talking just there. He had always known when talking was the right thing, and when being present was the better one. I looked out at the land, the dark, patient soil, the bare trees, the red roof of the house visible over the fence line from where I was sitting, the same roof. It had always been the same color Alton had chosen, so a man could find his way home from any direction. I had expected somewhere in the back of myself to feel something large and clear when this moment arrived, something that announced itself, a sense of completion or vindication, or the particular satisfaction of a long and difficult thing finally resolved. What I felt instead was quieter than any of that. It moved through me the way a long exhale moves, not dramatic, not triumphant, just the slow release of something that had been held for too long. The particular feeling of a weight that has been set down so gradually that you only understand how heavy it was once your hands are finally empty. Not victory. Something older and more honest than victory. Relief. The kitchen was quiet in the way it only gets after dark. During the day there was always something, the sound of the farm outside, wind against the windows, the particular creak of the house settling into whatever the weather was doing. But late evening had its own quality, a stillness that felt earned rather than empty, the kind that comes when the work is done and the world has agreed for a few hours at least to hold itself still. I had been sitting at the kitchen table for a while before I reached for the pen and paper. The table was the same one Loretta had used when the children were in school, a broad, solid piece of oak that had acquired over the decades the specific patina of a surface that has been written on, eaten at, cried over, and laughed across more times than anyone had bothered to count. She used to grade papers here on Sunday evenings, a cup of tea at her elbow, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, the way she always wore them when she was not actively looking through them. I had sat across from her at this table more evenings than I could number. I sat across from her absence now, and it was the kind of absence that has become familiar enough to be a form of company. I set the pen against the paper and began. The letter had no name at the top. I had started to write one and then stopped, because the more I thought about it, the more I understood that this was not a letter for a person. It was a letter for a place, for the land itself, and for whatever lives and hands would come to it after mine. I wrote slowly. My right hand had been regaining its steadiness over the past weeks. The physical therapist called it progress, and I supposed it was, though progress felt like a mild word for something that had required that much effort, but it still moved with a deliberateness that had not been there before, each letter requiring a small additional conversation between intention and execution. I had learned in the months since the stroke to stop resisting that deliberateness and simply work within it. Some things it turned out improved when you slowed down enough to mean them. I wrote about Alton first, not the legal version of Alton, not the name on the land certificate, the signature on the original deed, but the man I had known through the stories my father told, and the evidence he had left behind in the grain of every board in this house. A man who had looked at open prairie and seen not emptiness but potential, who had cut timber with his own hands, because that was the only way to build what he intended to build, who had chosen a red roof because he wanted his family to be able to find their way home from any direction. I wrote about what it means to make something by hand and leave it to someone else, and to trust that they will understand what they have been given. Then I wrote about Loretta, about the spring after we were married, when she had driven 2 hours to a nursery and come back with 6 bare root saplings in the bed of the pickup, and planted every one of them while I was out on the fence line and was sitting on an overturned bucket with dirt on her elbows when I came back at evening, about the way she had looked at those 6 sticks in the ground, like she was already seeing what they would become, because Loretta had always been that way, always living a little ahead of the present moment, always tending things that had not yet arrived at their fullness. The orchard was hers, in the way that certain things belonged to the person who first believed in them. It would always be hers regardless of whose name appeared on any document. I wrote about the children, about Cody and Griffin and Stella running the rows between the apple trees on summer evenings, when the light came in low and golden from the west, the way children run when they are not going anywhere in particular and do not need to be, about the sound of 3 sets of feet on the porch steps and breakfast in this kitchen before the school bus came, and the particular quality of a house that is full of children growing up in it, a fullness that you do not fully appreciate until it is gone and the rooms are quieter, and you understand that the noise was not a disruption, but the sound of the house being most completely itself, I did not write Cody's name any differently than the others. He was part of what this land had held the same as the rest of them. What had happened, and what was going to happen next was still being worked out in the slow, imperfect way that things between a father and a son get worked out. Not in a courtroom, not in a single conversation, but over time in the small, repeated choices that either build something back or confirm that it cannot be rebuilt. I did not know yet which it would be. I wrote his name anyway. Near the end of the letter, I wrote about what I had nearly lost. Not in the language of property or legal title, I had heard enough of that language to last me the rest of my life, but in the language of what this land actually was. The smell of it after rain, the specific quality of light on a cornfield in July, the weight of a fence post in both hands, the resistance of earth that knows what it is and does not give way without reason. The apple trees that Loretta had planted and that did not know she was gone and kept producing every September, regardless, as if faithfulness were simply what they did and they had never been taught any other way. No number had ever been large enough to contain any of that. No number ever would be. I set the pen down and read back over what I had written slowly, the way you read something you intend to mean, rather than simply to convey. Then I folded the pages carefully in thirds the way letters used to be folded, before the world decided that folding was unnecessary, and I held them for a moment. The house was very quiet around me. The kitchen clock marked its steady interval. Outside, the night lay over the 380 acres the way it always had, without asking anything, without requiring anything, simply present the way the land itself was present, patient and permanent and indifferent to everything that had tried to take it away. I carried the letter to the east barn, lifted the third board from the east wall, and placed it inside the wooden box on top of the old papers, the land certificate, the boundary agreement, the small blue notebook that had started all of this and ended it. Then I set the board back down and walked home under the stars. The roads were empty that early. That is the thing about county roads in Iowa. Before 7 in the morning, they belong entirely to whoever is on them, and whoever is on them at that hour has a reason to be. Farmers checking fields, a grain truck running an early route, the occasional deer standing in the ditch, watching you pass with the mild indifference of something that has decided cars are not its problem. I had driven these particular roads so many times over so many decades that my hands knew the turns before my eyes registered them, the truck moving through the familiar sequence of county routes with the ease of long habit. I had told no one I was going, not because I wanted secrecy. Griffin would have come. If I had asked, Stella would have offered to drive, but because some things are between a father and a son and the rest of the world. However well-meaning does not improve them by being present. I had thought about this morning for a long time. I had not thought about what I was going to say because I had learned by now that the things worth saying between Cody and me were not the kind that benefited from preparation. They came out right only when they came out unplanned. The facility was a low, unremarkable set of buildings outside of Ames, set back from the road behind a chain-link fence that managed to look both institutional and oddly ordinary, the kind of architecture designed to be neither punishing nor welcoming, just present. I pulled into the visitor lot and turned off the engine and sat for a moment. The morning was cold and clear. The sky the pale washed-out blue of early autumn, the kind of blue that is not yet committed to the season. A few other cars in the lot, a guard at the entrance booth reading something on a clipboard. Ordinary. Everything about the place was ordinary, which was somehow the strangest part of it, that something as consequential as what had happened to my family could have its ending in a place this unremarkable. The door opened at 8:15. Cody came out carrying a bag that was smaller than what I would have packed for a weekend. He had on a jacket I did not recognize, something new, or something I had simply never seen on him before, and he was thinner than the last time I had seen him in person, which had been the afternoon he sat on the edge of my hospital bed and said he was sorry. Thinner, and something else that I registered, but could not immediately name. Older was the closest word, but it was not quite right. It was more that something had been removed from his face, some layer of performance or deflection that had been there so long I had stopped noticing it and was now simply gone. He saw my truck and stopped for a half second, just a half second, barely enough to call it hesitation. Then he walked across the lot and got in. We did not speak right away. I pulled out of the lot and back onto the county road, and we drove in silence through the first few miles. Not an uncomfortable silence, not the silence of two people who have things to say and are refusing to say them, but the silence of two people who are simply getting used to being in the same space again, letting that fact settle before adding anything to it. The fields moved past on both sides, turned under for the season, dark and waiting. A water tower with the name of a town I had driven through 1,000 times. The familiar geometry of a landscape I had known my whole life. After a while, Cody said, "I didn't think you'd come." His voice was quieter than I remembered. Not weak, just quieter, like a man who had spent 18 months learning that the volume he used to use was not necessary. I kept my eyes on the road. "Where else would I be?" I said. He did not answer that. He looked out the window, and I let the road do the talking for another few miles. I pulled off at the diner in Ogden, a place that had been in the same building since before either of us was born, with vinyl booth seats and coffee that was reliably strong, and a menu that had not changed in any way that mattered since the 1970s. We slid into a booth by the window. A woman I recognized from the community meeting at First Lutheran, I could not recall her name, but remembered her face from the third row, brought us coffee without being asked, and left us to it, with the tact of a woman who understands when people need to be left alone. We sat with the coffee for a while. "I want to come back to the farm," Cody said finally. He said it looking at his cup rather than at me, which was honest. I'm not saying what I don't have any right to say. I just want to work it, the way Granddad did when he started out. Earn back he stopped. Earn my way back. I thought about Alton, who had built everything from nothing on the premise that a man proves what he is through what he does over time and not through what he claims in a single moment. I thought about the letter I had placed in the wooden box and the line I had written near the end of it about small repeated choices and what they build or fail to build over time. "We'll figure it out," I said. "Together." He nodded, and something in his shoulders released, not dramatically, just a small, quiet letting go. He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug, the way people do when they need something solid to hold on to. And we sat there in the booth by the window of the diner in Ogden while the morning came fully into itself outside. When we turned onto the farm road and came through the gate, Stella was on the porch. She had Macy beside her, the two of them standing in the particular way of people who have been waiting and are trying not to look like they have been waiting. Macy did not try to look like anything. The moment the truck slowed, she was off the porch and across the yard at a full run, arms out, entirely unconcerned with the gap between where she was and where she was going. Harvest comes the way it always has, without asking permission. One morning, the angle of the light is different. The air carries a weight that was not there the week before, and the corn is ready whether you are or not. There is no ceremony to it. No announcement beyond the smell of cut stalks and the particular low rumble of machinery moving through the rows in long, patient passes. I had stood at the edge of this field through more harvests than I had kept count of, and the sensation of it had not changed in any way that mattered. The same smell, the same sound, the same feeling of a year arriving at its accounting. I was standing there now at the eastern edge of the south field, with my hands in my jacket pockets, and the morning still cool enough that my breath showed faintly in the air. My right hand was steadier than it had been. Not all the way back, I had made a kind of peace with the likelihood that it would never be entirely what it was before, but steady enough. Steady enough to write, steady enough to grip a fence post, steady enough to feel like mine again, which was the thing that had mattered most. I had been up early out of habit, the body still keeping farmer's hours, regardless of what the calendar said about whether there was anything urgent to be done. I had walked the perimeter of the east field before the sun was fully up, the way I used to walk it every morning before everything changed, pressing my palm flat against the soil at the corner post, the way my father had taught me. The land had not changed. It did not know what had happened to it, or nearly happened to it. It was just land patient and dark and committed to its own continuance in a way that had nothing to do with any piece of paper filed in any county office. I turned and looked back toward the buildings. The east barn, the same one I had reached for as I went down the rough corner boards against my palm. The last thing I had grabbed before the world went away had been quietly transformed in the months since Cody came home. Griffin had done it gradually, without making a production of it. A desk brought in from the house, a second-hand bookshelf, 2 chairs, a lamp on an extension cord, a corkboard on the wall covered with maps of the 4-county region and printed sections of Iowa property law, and a hand-drawn sign that said Harlow Land Rights in letters that were large enough to read from the doorway, but uneven enough to have been made by a 6-year-old who had been asked very seriously if she wanted to help. Macy had been very certain about the lettering. Farmers had been coming in since early September, from Boone County, from Webster and Hamilton and Calhoun families who had read Dana Whitmore's article, or heard about it from someone who had, families who had their own versions of the same story, or were worried they might. Griffin sat with each of them at that desk, with the patience of a man who understood that the most useful thing he could do was listen first and advise second. He had not advertised. He had not needed to. In a community like this, one word moves the way water moves along the lowest available path, finding its way to wherever it is needed. I could see him now through the barn's open side door, bent over something on the desk, a coffee cup at his elbow, going cold the way it always did when he was focused. Cody was in the south field. He had been there since before I came out, the way he had been there since before I came out, almost every morning since September. He had asked when he first came back what work needed doing, and I had told him to start with the south field fence line, because it had needed attention for 2 seasons, and I had not gotten to it. He had spent 3 days on that fence line without being asked a second time, and when he was done, he had found the next thing that needed doing, without asking what it was. That was how Alton had done it. I was told had simply looked at what the land required and done it day after day, without needing the work to be assigned or the effort to be acknowledged. The land kept its own accounting of that kind of attention. Over time, it showed. Stella arrived at 11 with a basket over one arm, the old wicker one that had sat on the top shelf in the mudroom, since Loretta used it for the same purpose on the same walk, on the same late morning schedule more years ago than I could now easily count. She went to the south field first, and I watched from a distance as she and Cody sat on the tailgate of the work truck and ate, talking in the easy, unremarkable way of siblings who have been through something together and come out the other side still speaking, not repaired exactly, reconstituted, a different shape than before, but solid. Maxie came with her, of course. She had spent most of the morning in the small pasture near the north fence with the new foal, a dark bay filly born in late August that had, after a week of deliberation conducted with the seriousness of a municipal board, been named Loretta. Not Loretta after anyone in particular, Macy had explained when asked. Just Loretta because it was the right name for a horse. I had not argued with that logic because it was in the way that children's logic sometimes is entirely correct. Horace Webb appeared at the gate in the afternoon, the way he appeared at most things, without announcement, without explaining himself, leaning on the top rail with both forearms and looking out over the field, with the settled expression of a man who has lived long enough to understand that watching something good unfold quietly is one of the better things a day can offer. I walked over and stood beside him. We did not speak for a while. The harvester moved through the far rows in its long, patient arc. The afternoon light came down at the angle that October light comes down in Iowa, low and golden, making everything it touches look simultaneously ordinary and worth keeping. I thought about Alton, who had looked at this ground before a single furrow was turned and seen what it could become. I thought about Loretta, who had planted 6 bare sticks in the earth and called them magnificent before they had grown a single branch. I thought about what it had cost to keep this place, not the legal fees, not the medical bills, not the months of uncertainty and fear, but the older cost. The cost that does not appear in any accounting. The cost of understanding that something matters and being willing to stand in front of it. What I had protected was not the acreage, not the number, not the boundary lines, not the deed with the county recorder's stamp. What I had protected was this Griffin bent over a desk, helping a stranger understand their rights. Cody on a fence line doing the quiet work of becoming someone he could stand behind. Stella walking the same path her mother walked with the same basket over her arm. A little girl naming a horse after her grandmother with the casual certainty of someone who understands without being taught. That the people we love do not stop being present just because they are no longer here. Horace Webb straightened up from the fence rail, gave me one nod the way he gave most things, once deliberately, as if once was exactly the right number, and walked back toward his truck. I stayed at the fence a while longer. The corn came down in long rows, and the light moved across the field, and 380 acres breathed around me the way they always had, slow and certain. Like something that had been alive long before I got here and fully intended to go on. Looking back, the greatest tragedy wasn't my stroke, but the silence that allowed a family betrayal to take root. Don't be like me. Don't assume that shared blood means shared values. A beautiful family story can be hollowed out by greed if you don't guard it with vigilance and clear communication. The bitter lesson is that land has a price, but a legacy is bought with accountability. This family story taught me that ignoring the shadows only lets them grow into a nightmare. In my darkest hour, I turned to God seeking the strength to endure what my own son had orchestrated. I nearly lost everything because I failed to see the signs of a family betrayal unfolding under my own roof. Ultimately, I chose to forgive, not to excuse the past, but to rebuild our future. A family betrayal leaves a permanent scar, yet it can also serve as a landmark for where we chose to start over. Every family story is a testament that we must protect our heritage with more than just fences. We must protect it with our lives. Thank you for accompanying me to the conclusion of this path. Please share your thoughts in the comments. How would you navigate Eugene's situation or such a complex moral dilemma? I am eager to hear your perspective. If this narrative resonated with you, please subscribe to ensure you see our future videos. A brief note. Although influenced by complex social issues and rural life, certain parts have been dramatized for the sake of the narrative. If this content isn't to your liking, feel free to browse other videos that better match your interests.